The rusted pickaxe struck something that wasn't rock, sending a metallic clang echoing through the abandoned mine shaft that would soon rewrite history books and prove that legends sometimes hide in the most unlikely places. Sarah Chen wiped the sweat from her brow with a dirt-stained sleeve, her headlamp illuminating what appeared to be the corner of an ornate chest buried beneath 3 centuries of debris and forgotten dreams. Before we dive deeper into this incredible discovery, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story captivates you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow I have another amazing tale that will leave you speechless. Sarah had always been different from the other girls in Millbrook Valley, a farming community nestled in the shadow of the Colorado Rockies, where tradition ran as deep as the irrigation ditches that fed the endless fields of corn and wheat. While her classmates spent their summers at the community pool or hanging around the single shopping center, Sarah could be found exploring the network of abandoned mining tunnels that honeycombed the mountains surrounding their town. Her father, David Chen, had moved their family to Colorado when Sarah was 12, purchasing a struggling 200-acre farm that previous owners had abandoned after years of poor harvests and mounting debt. The Chen family stood out in Millbrook Valley for more reasons than their Asian heritage. While most farming families had roots stretching back 4 or 5 generations, the Chens were newcomers who had arrived with city ways and unfamiliar farming techniques. David had been a geology professor at Denver University before a budget crisis eliminated his position, forcing him to use his life savings to buy the farm and start over in middle age. Sarah's mother, Lynn, struggled to adapt from her previous life as a research librarian to the demanding physical labor of farm work. But she threw herself into learning everything about sustainable agriculture and organic farming methods that their neighbors viewed with suspicion. Sarah inherited her father's scientific curiosity and her mother's methodical research approach, creating a unique combination that served her well in her unofficial role as the valley's amateur historian and explorer. By age 16, she had mapped more of the old mining tunnels than anyone else in living memory, carefully documenting her findings in detailed journals that she filled with sketches, measurements, and historical observations. Her bedroom walls were covered with hand-drawn maps showing the intricate network of shafts, chambers, and connecting passages that had been carved into the mountainside during the Colorado silver boom of the 1870s. The abandoned Esperanza mine had always held special fascination for Sarah, and partly because of its romantic Spanish name that seemed oddly out of place among the utilitarian designations of neighboring claims like the Lucky Strike, the Silver Dollar, and the Hard Rock. Local folklore suggested that the Esperanza had been worked by Spanish explorers long before American prospectors arrived in the region, but most residents dismissed such stories as romantic nonsense with no basis in historical fact. The County Historical Society's official records showed no evidence of Spanish activity in the area before the 1860s, and the few academic papers written about regional mining history made no mention of pre-American mineral extraction. Sarah's fascination with the Esperanza began during her freshman year of high school, when she discovered a reference to the mine in her great-grandfather's journals. Chen Wei had been a Chinese immigrant who worked as a cook and supply manager for various mining operations throughout Colorado in the early 1900s. His detailed daily records, written in a mixture of English and Chinese characters, mentioned several occasions when he delivered food and equipment to workers at the Esperanza. More intriguingly, Chen Wei had noted that the mine's tunnels seemed to extend much deeper and farther than the relatively recent American excavations would suggest. The old passages go back farther than anyone remembers, Chen Wei had written. In his careful script, workers speak in whispers about chambers that were already carved when the first Americans arrived. They say the Spanish worked these mountains centuries ago, following veins of silver that led to something much more valuable hidden in the deepest parts of the earth. Sarah had shared these entries with her high school history teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who expressed polite interest, but explained that family stories often grew in the telling and that there was no credible historical evidence for Spanish mining activity in their specific region. The Spanish had certainly explored Colorado during the 16th and 17th centuries, Mrs. Patterson acknowledged, but their documented routes and mining operations were concentrated hundreds of miles to the south. The idea that conquistadors had established major mining operations in what was now Millbrook Valley was considered by serious historians to be local folklore with no factual foundation. This academic dismissal only intensified Sarah's curiosity. She began spending her free time researching Spanish colonial history, learning about the extensive network of mines that conquistadors had established throughout the American Southwest and Mexico. She studied accounts of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's expeditions, Hernando de Soto's explorations, and the countless smaller expeditions that had pushed into uncharted territories seeking gold, silver, and other precious resources. The more she learned, the more plausible it seemed that Spanish explorers might have ventured farther north than official histories acknowledged. Sarah's parents initially encouraged her historical interests, viewing them as a healthy intellectual pursuit that balanced the physical demands of farm work. David appreciated his daughter's scientific approach to research and exploration, while Lynn helped her translate Spanish documents and provided guidance on proper research methodology. However, as Sarah's obsession with the old mines grew more intense, her parents began to worry about the amount of time she spent underground in potentially dangerous conditions. The abandoned mine shafts presented numerous hazards that made exploration risky, even for experienced cavers. Structural supports installed decades earlier had deteriorated over time, creating the possibility of tunnel collapses. Water seepage had made many passages treacherous, and the lack of proper ventilation meant that dangerous gases could accumulate in poorly ventilated chambers. Sarah's parents had reluctantly agreed to let her continue her explorations only after she demonstrated proficiency with proper safety equipment and agreed to never venture underground alone. This safety requirement led to an ongoing source of frustration for Sarah, as finding companions willing to spend hours crawling through cramped, dark tunnels proved nearly impossible. Most of her classmates considered her hobby bizarre and potentially dangerous, preferring to spend their time on more conventional teenage activities. The few friends who initially expressed interest in joining her explorations quickly lost enthusiasm. After experiencing the claustrophobic conditions and physical demands of underground travel. By her junior year, Sarah had developed a reputation in Millbrook Valley as an eccentric but harmless oddball whose passion for old mines was tolerated. As a quirky personality trait, teachers praised her dedication to historical research, and her detailed documentation of local mining history had earned recognition from the County Historical Society, but most people viewed her work as an interesting hobby rather than serious scholarship. The general consensus was that Sarah's enthusiasm was admirable, but that her theories about Spanish colonial mining were products of an overactive imagination rather than legitimate historical inquiry. This patronizing attitude became particularly evident during Sarah's junior year when she presented her research findings to the monthly meeting of the Millbrook Valley Historical Society. She had prepared a comprehensive presentation that included her great-grandfather's journal entries, her detailed maps of the mining tunnels, and her analysis of geological formations that suggested much older excavation techniques than those used by American prospectors. The society members listened politely to her 20-minute presentation, asked a few perfunctory questions, and then proceeded to discuss more conventional topics like preserving historic barns and organizing the annual Heritage Festival. After the meeting, Society President Harold Brennan approached Sarah with what he clearly intended as encouragement, but which felt more like condescension. "You've done some impressive work for someone your age," he told her with a patronizing smile. "It's wonderful to see young people taking an interest in local history. Of course, you have to be careful not to let your imagination run away with you. Real historical research requires sticking to documented facts rather than chasing romantic legends." The dismissive tone stung more than Sarah had expected, particularly because she had spent months preparing her presentation and had hoped for serious engagement with her research findings. She realized that being taken seriously as a historian would require more than enthusiasm and amateur documentation. She needed to find concrete proof that would force skeptics to acknowledge the validity of her theories, proof that could only be found in the deepest, most dangerous parts of the abandoned mines where no one else was willing to venture. Sarah's determination to prove her theories correct led to increasingly bold exploration attempts during her senior year. She upgraded her safety equipment, purchased professional-grade mapping tools, and began systematically exploring the deepest, accessible portions of the Esperanza mine. Her maps showed that the main shaft descended more than 300 feet into the mountain, with a complex network of side tunnels and chambers that seemed to follow natural geological formations rather than the more systematic grid patterns typical of American mining operations. The deeper she ventured into the mine, the more convinced she became that the tunnels showed evidence of much older construction techniques. The walls in the deepest chambers showed tool marks that differed significantly from those found in the upper levels, and the overall layout suggested a sophisticated understanding of geology that seemed inconsistent with the relatively crude methods used by most 19th-century American prospectors. These observations, however, remained subjective interpretations that skeptics could easily dismiss as wishful thinking or misidentification of natural rock formations. Everything changed on a cold Saturday morning in February when Sarah made the decision to explore a partially collapsed side tunnel that she had previously avoided due to its dangerous condition. Recent winter storms had caused additional rockfalls that partially cleared the obstruction, creating a narrow passage that might allow access to chambers beyond. Against her better judgment and in violation of her parents' safety rules, Sarah decided to attempt the dangerous passage alone, driven by an intuition that something significant lay waiting in the unexplored sections of the mine. The crawl through the unstable passage took nearly an hour of careful maneuvering around loose rocks and rotting timber supports. Sarah's headlamp illuminated a treacherous obstacle course of debris that threatened to shift at the slightest disturbance, but her determination to reach the chamber beyond overcame her natural caution. When she finally emerged into a previously unknown section of the mine, her breath caught at the sight of walls that showed clear evidence of hand-carved construction techniques completely different from anything she had encountered in the upper levels. The chamber was roughly circular, approximately 15 feet in diameter, with walls that curved upward to form a natural dome. Unlike the angular, geometric excavations typical of American mining operations, this space seemed to have been carved to follow the natural contours of the rock formation, creating an almost artistic effect that spoke of builders who valued aesthetics as well as functionality. The floor was covered with centuries of accumulated debris, but Sarah could see the outlines of what appeared to be carefully fitted stone blocks beneath the rubble. More significantly, the walls of the chamber were decorated with carved symbols that bore no resemblance to anything Sarah had seen in American mining sites. The markings appeared to be a combination of geometric patterns and what might have been stylized representations of animals or natural features, executed with a level of skill and artistry that suggested professional craftsmanship rather than casual graffiti. Some of the symbols appeared to be numbers or letters, but in a script that Sarah couldn't immediately identify, though certain elements reminded her of the Spanish colonial documents she had studied. As Sarah began to document her discovery with photographs and detailed sketches, her excitement grew with the realization that she had found something genuinely significant, something that could potentially validate years of research and speculation. This was concrete, physical evidence that the Esperanza mine had indeed been worked by people with very different cultural and technological backgrounds than the American prospectors who had reopened it in the 1870s. The carved chamber represented proof that her theories about Spanish colonial mining activity were based on historical reality rather than romantic imagination. The discovery of the carved chamber marked the beginning of what would become the most important archaeological find in Colorado mining history, though Sarah had no way of knowing that her exploration had only scratched the surface of what lay buried in the deepest recesses of the Esperanza mine. The ornate chest that her pickaxe would soon uncover contained treasures that would rewrite textbooks and force historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Spanish exploration of the American West. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed the carved symbols, her camera flash illuminating details that had remained hidden in darkness for centuries. The geometric patterns seemed to dance in the artificial light, creating shadows that revealed even more intricate workmanship than she had initially noticed. Each symbol appeared to have been carefully planned and executed, with depths and angles that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of stone carving techniques. This wasn't the crude scratching of bored miners killing time during slow work periods, but the deliberate artwork of skilled craftsmen who had taken pride in their construction. Discovery energized Sarah beyond anything she had experienced in her years of exploration. She spent the next 4 hours in the chamber, meticulously documenting every carved symbol, measuring dimensions, and creating detailed sketches that captured nuances her camera couldn't reproduce. Her notebook filled with observations about tool marks, construction techniques, and architectural features that seemed completely inconsistent with 19th century American mining practices. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, yet she knew that convincing others would require more than photographs and drawings. When Sarah finally emerged from the mine that afternoon, she was covered in dirt and rock dust, her clothes torn from crawling through the collapsed passage, but her eyes shone with the excitement of genuine discovery. She drove directly to the Millbrook Valley Library, where her mother worked part-time, cataloging the historical collection. Lin Chen was organizing archived newspapers when Sarah burst through the door, practically vibrating with enthusiasm about her underground findings. "Mom, you have to see what I found," Sarah said, spreading her photographs across the library table with hands that still shook from adrenaline. "Look at these carvings. This isn't American work. These symbols, this construction technique, it's completely different from anything else in the mine." Lynn examined the photographs with the careful attention to detail that had made her an excellent research librarian. Her expression grew increasingly thoughtful as she studied the images, occasionally reaching for a magnifying glass to examine specific details more closely. After several minutes of silent analysis, she looked up at her daughter with a mixture of excitement and concern. "These are remarkable, Sarah. But you need to understand what you're claiming," Lynn said carefully. "If these carvings are authentic, pre-American artifacts, this could be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Colorado history. But that also means you're challenging established historical understanding, and academics don't change their minds easily." Sarah nodded impatiently, having expected this cautionary response from her methodical mother. "I know it's significant," That's exactly why we need to document everything properly and present the evidence in a way that serious historians can't dismiss. Lynn's concern deepened as she realized the implications of her daughter's discovery. Sarah, if you're right about this, it means you've been exploring areas of the mine that are probably extremely dangerous. Promise me you won't go back there alone. The promise Sarah made to her mother was sincere but ultimately unkeepable, as she would soon discover that the carved chamber was only the beginning of what lay hidden in the deepest sections of the Esperanza mine. However, for the moment, she focused on the immediate challenge of presenting her findings in a way that would command serious attention from local historians and perhaps attract interest from professional archaeologists. Sarah's first step was to research proper archaeological documentation procedures, spending hours online learning about standardized methods for recording and preserving historical artifacts. She discovered that her amateur documentation, while enthusiastic, fell far short of professional standards. Proper archaeological investigation required systematic grid mapping, detailed provenance records, careful preservation of any artifacts, and expert analysis of construction techniques and dating methods. The realization that she lacked proper training and equipment to fully investigate her discovery was frustrating, but Sarah was determined to find a way to bring professional expertise to bear on the carved chamber. She began reaching out to archaeology departments at universities throughout Colorado, sending carefully composed emails that described her findings and requested guidance on proper investigation procedures. Most of her messages went unanswered, while the few responses she received were politely dismissive form letters that suggested she contact local historical societies or amateur archaeology clubs. Dr. Margaret Winters, professor of American history at Colorado State University, provided the most detailed response to Sarah's inquiry, but her message was hardly encouraging. "While I appreciate your enthusiasm for local history," Dr. Winters wrote, "claims about Spanish colonial mining activity in northern Colorado require extraordinary evidence to support them. The documented historical record shows no credible evidence for Spanish mining operations in your region, and amateur discoveries are frequently misinterpreted due to lack of proper training and context." The academic dismissal stung, particularly because Dr. Winters had clearly not examined Sarah's photographic evidence before rendering her judgment. The response felt like a form letter designed to discourage amateur historians without actually engaging with their research findings. Sarah realized that overcoming this institutional skepticism would require more than photographs and documentation, no matter how carefully prepared. Meanwhile, news of Sarah's discovery began spreading through Millbrook Valley's tight-knit community, generating reactions that ranged from excitement to skepticism to outright ridicule. Her high school classmates were initially impressed by the mysterious photographs, but their interest quickly faded when they realized that Sarah's discovery didn't translate into anything immediately relevant to their teenage concerns. The carved symbols were undeniably cool, but they didn't change anyone's daily routine or provide new entertainment options in a town where excitement was always in short supply. The adult community's response was more complex and ultimately more problematic. For Sarah's hopes of gaining serious support for further investigation, Harold Brennan and other members of the Historical Society expressed polite interest in her findings, but made it clear that they considered her interpretation of the evidence to be overly ambitious. At the Society's next monthly meeting, Brennan presented Sarah's photographs as an interesting example of creative historical speculation, but cautioned against jumping to conclusions about their significance. Young Sarah has certainly found some interesting rock formations and what appear to be natural erosion patterns that create the illusion of deliberate carving, Brennan explained to the assembled society members. It's a good reminder that we, need to be careful about letting our imaginations run away with us when we encounter unusual geological features. The casual dismissal of her carefully documented evidence as natural erosion patterns infuriated Sarah, particularly because Brennan clearly hadn't examined her photographs with any serious attention to detail. The carved symbols showed clear evidence of tool marks, consistent depth, and deliberate design that couldn't possibly be explained as natural rock formation. Brennan's dismissal seemed based more on his preconceived notions about what was historically possible than on any actual analysis of the evidence she had presented. More troubling was the response from some community members who seemed to view Sarah's claims as deliberate attention-seeking rather than legitimate historical research. Betty Morrison, who owned the town's only bookstore and considered herself an authority on local history, made several pointed comments about young people these days who were always trying to make themselves seem special by claiming to discover things that aren't really there. The suggestion that she was fabricating evidence for personal attention was particularly hurtful, because Sarah had always been motivated by genuine intellectual curiosity rather than any desire for social recognition. Her years of systematic exploration and documentation had been driven by a sincere passion for understanding the region's history, not by any need to make herself the center of attention. The accusation of dishonesty felt like a betrayal by community members who had known her since childhood. Even more problematic was the reaction from some of her teachers and school administrators, who seemed concerned that Sarah's obsession with the old mines was becoming unhealthy and potentially dangerous. Principal Williams called Sarah's parents to express his worry that their daughter's underground activities were putting her at physical risk and might be interfering with her academic performance. While Sarah's grades remained excellent, Williams suggested that she should focus her energy on more conventional extracurricular activities that would be more beneficial for college applications. The principal's concern was well-intentioned, but reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what drove Sarah's exploration activities. Far from being a distraction from her education, her historical research had actually enhanced her academic performance by providing real-world applications for her studies in history, geology, and archaeology. Her systematic documentation of mining tunnels had improved her technical drawing skills. Her research into Spanish colonial history had strengthened her language abilities, and her analysis of geological formations had deepened her understanding of earth sciences. However, Sarah realized that defending her activities required more than pointing out their educational value. She needed to produce evidence so compelling that even skeptics would be forced to acknowledge the significance of her discoveries. The carved chamber was impressive, but it wasn't enough to overcome the institutional resistance she was encountering from historians, educators, and community leaders who seemed determined to maintain their existing understanding of regional history. Sarah's frustration with the lukewarm reception of her findings led to a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for both her personal safety and her historical research. She resolved to return to the deepest sections of the Esperanza mine to search for additional evidence that would support her theories about Spanish colonial mining activity. If carved symbols weren't sufficient to convince skeptics, perhaps she could find actual artifacts that would provide undeniable proof of pre-American mining operations. The decision to continue her underground exploration, despite her parents' concerns and the community's skepticism, reflected Sarah's growing determination to prove that her theories were based on solid evidence rather than wishful thinking. She had spent years developing her expertise in mining, tunnel navigation, had invested in proper safety equipment, and had carefully documented her procedures to minimize risk. Most importantly, she was driven by a genuine desire to uncover historical truth, rather than by any reckless pursuit of adventure or attention. Sarah began planning her return to the carved chamber with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all her research activities. She studied her maps to identify the safest routes through the mine's complex tunnel system, researched proper archaeological excavation techniques, and assembled equipment that would allow her to document any additional discoveries with professional-level precision. Her preparations took several weeks, during which she continued to face skepticism and discouragement from community members who seemed determined to dismiss her findings without serious investigation. The most painful rejection came from Mrs. Patterson, her high school history teacher, who had initially encouraged Sarah's interest in local historical research. During a private conversation after class, Mrs. Patterson expressed concern that Sarah was becoming too emotionally invested in theories that lacked sufficient evidence to support them. "I admire your passion for history, Sarah, but you need to understand that real historical research requires accepting evidence that contradicts our preferred theories," Mrs. Patterson said with the patient tone teachers used for difficult conversations. "Sometimes the most romantic explanations aren't the correct ones, and we have to be willing to acknowledge when our hypotheses aren't supported by credible evidence." The implication that Sarah was allowing romantic fantasies to cloud her judgment was particularly frustrating because she had approached her research with rigorous attention to documentation and analysis. Her theories about Spanish colonial mining weren't based on wishful thinking, but on systematic observation of physical evidence that seemed to contradict accepted historical understanding. Mrs. Patterson's dismissal felt like a betrayal by someone who should have appreciated the quality of Sarah's research methodology. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated in her conviction that the Esperanza mine contained evidence of significant historical importance. Her discovery of the carved chamber should have been the beginning of serious archaeological investigation, but instead it had become a source of community controversy that painted her as an attention-seeking teenager whose imagination had run away with her judgment. The dismissive reactions had convinced Sarah that further discoveries would be necessary to overcome the skepticism she was encountering. The stage was set for Sarah's return to the dangerous depths of the abandoned mine, where her pickaxe would soon strike something that would vindicate years of research and prove that sometimes the most incredible discoveries are made by those who refuse to accept conventional wisdom about what is historically possible. The morning mist clung to the mountainside as Sarah approached the Esperanza mine entrance for what would become the most important day of her life, though she had no way of knowing that her careful preparations were about to be rewarded beyond her wildest expectations. She had waited 3 weeks for optimal conditions, monitoring weather patterns and her parents' schedules to ensure she would have sufficient uninterrupted time for thorough exploration. Her backpack contained newly purchased archaeological tools, professional-grade documentation equipment, and enough supplies to spend an entire day underground, if necessary. Sarah's methodical approach to this expedition reflected lessons learned from her previous discovery of the carved chamber. She had spent hours studying proper excavation techniques, learning how to preserve artifacts and maintain detailed records that would satisfy professional archaeological standards. Her notebook contained carefully prepared grid maps, measurement, scales, and documentation protocols that would allow her to record any findings with scientific precision. This wasn't going to be another amateur exploration that skeptics could dismiss as wishful thinking or inadequate documentation. The entrance to the Esperanza mine looked particularly forbidding in the early morning light, with shadows creating the illusion of depths that seemed to extend infinitely into the mountain's heart. Sarah paused at the threshold, adjusting her headlamp and checking her safety equipment one final time. The weight of community skepticism pressed down on her almost as heavily as the mountain above the tunnels. But her determination to uncover the truth had grown stronger with each dismissive comment and patronizing suggestion that she focus her energy on more conventional pursuits. Sarah's descent through the mine's upper levels proceeded smoothly, following routes she had traveled dozens of times during her years of systematic exploration. The familiar passages provided reassurance as she made her way toward the deeper sections where the carved chamber awaited further investigation. Her headlamp beams swept across walls that told the story of American mining operations from the Yao 1870s, with tool marks and construction techniques that she could now easily distinguish from the much older workmanship she had discovered in the hidden chamber. The contrast between American and Spanish construction methods had become increasingly clear to Sarah as she developed her expertise in recognizing different mining techniques. The American sections showed the characteristic angular cuts and systematic grid patterns that reflected efficient but utilitarian approaches to mineral extraction. Every tunnel, chamber, and support structure had been designed for maximum productivity, with minimal concern for aesthetics or long-term preservation. The goal had been to extract as much silver as possible in the shortest time, then move on to more promising claims. The Spanish sections, by contrast, showed evidence of builders who had approached their work with completely different priorities and techniques. The curved walls and carefully fitted stone blocks suggested craftsmen who valued permanence and artistic achievement as much as functional efficiency. The construction methods reflected a long-term perspective that assumed the mines would be worked for decades or centuries rather than abandoned as soon as the easily accessible ore was exhausted. Sarah reached the partially collapsed passage that led to the carved chamber without incident, though the unstable rock seemed even more treacherous than during her previous visit. Winter weather had caused additional settling that made the crawl space narrower and more dangerous, requiring careful maneuvering around loose stones that threatened to shift at the slightest disturbance. The psychological pressure of knowing that tons of rock hung precariously above the passage made every movement a calculated risk, but Sarah's determination to reach the chamber beyond overcame her natural caution. Emerging into the carved chamber felt like entering a cathedral dedicated to forgotten gods, with shadows dancing across ancient symbols that seemed to whisper secrets from centuries past. Sarah's enhanced lighting equipment revealed details that had been invisible during her first visit, including additional carved elements that extended higher up the curved walls than her previous documentation had captured. The chamber was even more impressive than she had remembered, with artistic flourishes that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both engineering and aesthetics. Sarah began her systematic documentation of the chamber with photographs taken from multiple angles, using professional lighting techniques to eliminate shadows and capture every detail of the carved symbols. Her new equipment allowed her to create high-resolution images that would preserve fine details invisible to casual observation. Each photograph was carefully catalogued with location coordinates, lighting conditions, and detailed notes about the specific features being documented. The carved symbols revealed additional complexity under Sarah's improved lighting, with several panels showing what appeared to be narrative sequences rather than random decorative elements. One section seemed to depict a journey through mountainous terrain, with stylized representations of peaks, valleys, and what might have been mining operations. Another panel showed figures that could have been people or animals engaged in activities that weren't immediately identifiable, but suggested some kind of organized work or ceremonial function. Most intriguingly, several symbols bore striking resemblance to Spanish colonial markers that Sarah had encountered in her research into Conquistador exploration records. The combination of geometric patterns and naturalistic representations was consistent with documentation techniques used by Spanish expeditions to mark important locations and record significant discoveries. If her interpretation was correct, the carved chamber represented not just evidence of Spanish mining activity, but a deliberate record of their operations in the region. Sarah's excitement grew as she realized that the symbols might actually be readable if she could identify the specific notation system being used. Spanish colonial expeditions had employed various methods for recording information about their discoveries, including standardized symbols for different types of mineral deposits, navigation markers, and territorial claims. If the Esperanza carvings followed similar conventions, they might contain specific information about the scope and purpose of Spanish mining operations in the area. After completing her photographic documentation of the carved chamber, Sarah began the next phase of her investigation by carefully examining the debris-covered floor for any artifacts that might have been left behind by the original builders. Her new archaeological tools allowed her to systematically excavate small, test areas without disturbing the overall integrity of the site. The process was painstakingly slow, requiring careful removal of centuries of accumulated sediment while preserving any objects that might be buried beneath. The first hour of excavation yielded nothing more interesting than broken rocks and decomposed organic material that had probably washed into the chamber during periodic flooding. Sarah's initial optimism began to fade as her systematic grid search revealed no obvious artifacts or construction materials that would provide additional evidence about the chamber's origins. The carved walls were impressive, but she needed tangible objects that could be dated and analyzed by professional archaeologists. Sarah's persistence was rewarded when her trowel struck something metallic buried beneath a pile of fallen rocks. Near the chamber's eastern wall, careful excavation revealed the corner of what appeared to be a heavily corroded metal object, possibly iron or steel, that had been completely concealed by debris. The size and shape suggested something larger than a simple tool or personal belonging, possibly a container or piece of equipment that had been deliberately placed rather than accidentally dropped. The excavation of the buried object required extreme care to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath the accumulated debris. Sarah worked with the patience of a professional archaeologist, removing sediment grain by grain and documenting the precise location of every fragment she uncovered. The process took nearly 2 hours, but gradually revealed the outline of an ornate metal chest, approximately 18 inches square and 12 inches deep. Sarah's second attempt to engage academic expertise proved equally frustrating when she contacted Dr. Michael Harrison, an archaeology professor at Colorado State University, whose research focused on mining history throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Dr. Harrison's initial response was more polite than Dr. Valdez's message, but equally dismissive of Sarah's claims about discovering Spanish colonial artifacts in an area where such finds were considered historically impossible. "I understand your excitement about what appears to be an interesting metal container," Dr. Harrison wrote, "but you need to understand that artifact identification requires extensive training and professional analysis. What might appear to be Spanish colonial craftsmanship to an untrained observer could easily be misidentified American mining equipment, decorative household items, or even modern reproductions placed by previous explorers." Dr. Harrison's suggestion that the ornate chest might be modern equipment or deliberately planted reproductions was particularly insulting because it implied either incompetence or dishonesty on Sarah's part. Her careful documentation had clearly shown the artifact's burial beneath centuries of accumulated debris in a chamber that showed no evidence of recent disturbance. The professor's willingness to propose implausible alternative explanations, rather than seriously examining her evidence, demonstrated the kind of institutional bias that Sarah was beginning to recognize as a major obstacle to having her discoveries properly investigated. The pattern of academic dismissal continued through Sarah's attempts to contact archaeology departments at universities throughout Colorado and neighboring states. Her carefully prepared presentations of photographic evidence, detailed documentation, and thorough analysis were consistently met with polite but firm rejections that emphasized the improbability of Spanish colonial artifacts being found in her specific region. Several professors suggested that she was misidentifying American mining equipment or natural rock formations, while others implied that her amateur status disqualified her from making credible archaeological discoveries. Most frustrating was the response from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, director of the Colorado Archaeological Survey, who dismissed Sarah's findings without even requesting additional documentation. Claims about major archaeological discoveries by amateur explorers require verification by professional archaeologists before they can be considered credible, Dr. Walsh wrote. The specific region you mention has been thoroughly surveyed by professional teams, and no evidence of Spanish colonial activity has ever been documented there. The assertion that the Esperanza mine region had been thoroughly surveyed was demonstrably false, as Sarah's own exploration had revealed extensive tunnel systems that no professional archaeologist had ever examined. Dr. Walsh's dismissal seemed based on bureaucratic assumptions rather than actual knowledge of the site's archaeological potential. The professor's unwillingness to even consider the possibility that previous surveys might have been incomplete reflected the kind of institutional arrogance that prevented genuine discoveries from receiving proper investigation. Sarah's frustration with academic resistance was compounded by the reaction she encountered from local community leaders when word of her latest discoveries began spreading through Millbrook Valley's social networks. Harold Brennan and other members of the Historical Society initially expressed polite interest in her photographs of the ornate chest, but their enthusiasm quickly cooled when Sarah explained the implications of her findings for accepted understanding of regional history. Now, Sarah, you need to be careful about making claims that go beyond what the evidence actually supports, Brennan cautioned during a private conversation after the Historical Society's monthly meeting. That's certainly an interesting metal container you found, but jumping to conclusions about Spanish conquistadors might be getting ahead of yourself. There could be any number of explanations for how such an object ended up in the mine. Brennan's suggestion that the ornate chest could have any number of explanations was typical of the creative skepticism that Sarah encountered whenever she presented evidence that challenged conventional historical understanding. Rather than examining her documentation with serious attention to detail, local historians seemed determined to find alternative explanations that would preserve their existing beliefs about regional history. The pattern was becoming frustratingly familiar. Initial polite interest, followed by increasingly strained attempts to explain away evidence that didn't fit accepted historical frameworks. More troubling was the reaction from several community members who seemed to view Sarah's archaeological claims as a threat to local identity and historical understanding. Betty Morrison, the bookstore owner who considered herself an authority on regional history, made several pointed comments about young people who think they know better than established experts, and suggested that Sarah's discoveries were probably wishful thinking dressed up as serious research. The personal attacks on Sarah's credibility were particularly painful because they came from people who had known her since childhood and should have been familiar with her serious approach to historical research. Morrison's suggestion that her findings were based on wishful thinking ignored years of systematic exploration and careful documentation that had established Sarah's reputation as a thorough and reliable researcher. The willingness to dismiss her work without serious examination reflected the kind of prejudice against amateur historians that made genuine discoveries difficult to present to professional audiences. Principal William's concern about Sarah's unhealthy obsession with the abandoned mines intensified after news of her latest discovery spread through the school community. The principal called Sarah's parents to express his worry that their daughter's underground activities were becoming increasingly dangerous and might be interfering with her preparation for college applications. Williams suggested that Sarah should focus her energy on more conventional academic pursuits that would demonstrate her seriousness about higher education. "I'm not questioning Sarah's intelligence or dedication," Williams explained to her parents during a conference meeting. "But college admissions committees look for well-rounded students with balanced extracurricular activities. This obsession with old mines and far-fetched historical theories might give the impression that she lacks good judgment or academic focus." The principal's characterization of Sarah's archaeological research as far-fetched historical theories was particularly frustrating because it demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of the quality and significance of her discoveries. Her systematic documentation of Spanish colonial artifacts represented exactly the kind of original research that college admissions committees typically found impressive. Yet Williams seemed to view her work as a liability rather than an asset. For her academic future, Sarah's parents found themselves caught between their pride in their daughter's remarkable discoveries and their concern about the social and academic consequences of her increasingly controversial research. David Chen appreciated the scientific rigor of Sarah's archaeological methodology, while Lynn admired her daughter's persistence in the face of institutional resistance. However, both parents worried that Sarah's determination to prove her theories about Spanish colonial mining might be creating unnecessary conflicts with local authorities and academic institutions. "We support your research, sweetheart, but you need to consider whether this battle is worth the cost," Lynn said during a family discussion about Sarah's latest encounters with academic skepticism. "If every expert is telling you that your theories are wrong, maybe you should consider the possibility that they know something you don't." The suggestion that she should defer to expert opinion, despite having physical evidence that contradicted accepted historical understanding, was deeply troubling to Sarah. Her discoveries weren't based on theories or speculation, but on actual artifacts that could be examined, analyzed, and verified by anyone willing to investigate them properly. The fact that experts were unwilling to examine her evidence before dismissing her claims suggested that institutional bias rather than scientific rigor was driving their negative responses. Sarah's isolation from both academic and community support was becoming increasingly apparent as her discoveries generated more controversy than recognition. The ornate chest that should have vindicated her years of research had instead intensified the resistance she faced from people who seemed determined to maintain their existing beliefs about regional history, regardless of contradictory evidence. The pattern of dismissal and personal attacks was wearing down her confidence and making her question whether pursuing her archaeological research was worth the social and academic costs. The chest's condition was remarkable considering its apparent age and the harsh conditions of its underground environment. While the metal surface showed obvious corrosion from centuries of exposure to moisture, the basic structure remained intact, with decorative elements still visible beneath the rust and mineral deposits. The workmanship was clearly European, with design motifs that Sarah recognized from her research into Spanish colonial metalwork. Most significantly, the chest bore carved symbols that matched several of the wall carvings, suggesting a direct connection between the chamber's builders and whoever had placed the container in its current location. The symbols appeared to be a combination of Spanish letters and numbers, along with geometric patterns that might have represented dates, coordinates, or coded information about the chest's contents. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized that she might be looking at an actual Spanish colonial artifact that could provide definitive proof of her theories about pre-American mining activity. The chest was far too heavy for Sarah to lift alone, and its corroded condition made any attempt to move it potentially dangerous for both the artifact and her own safety. Professional conservation would be required to properly open and examine the container without causing irreparable damage to whatever it might contain. However, Sarah could see that the chest was clearly artificial rather than natural, unmistakably. Manufactured rather than coincidentally shaped by geological processes, and definitely consistent with Spanish colonial craftsmanship. Sarah spent the next several hours documenting the chest's position, dimensions, decorative elements, and relationship to the carved chamber's other features. Her photographs captured every detail of the artifact's surface, while her measurements and sketches provided precise technical specifications that would allow professional archaeologists to understand exactly what she had discovered. The documentation was exhaustive, reflecting her determination to present evidence that couldn't be dismissed as amateur speculation or wishful interpretation. As Sarah prepared to leave the chamber and return to the surface, she realized that her discovery of the ornate chest represented a crucial turning point in her battle to prove the historical significance of the Esperanza mine. The carved symbols could potentially be explained away as natural formations or modern additions, but a Spanish colonial chest, buried beneath centuries of debris, was undeniable physical evidence that would force even the most skeptical historians to reconsider their assumptions about regional exploration patterns. The weight of her discovery pressed down on Sarah as she made her way through the dangerous passage that led back to the mine's upper levels. She was carrying photographic evidence of what might be one of the most significant archaeological finds in Colorado history. But she also knew that presenting her findings would trigger a new level of controversy and skepticism from people who had already demonstrated their unwillingness to seriously consider her research. Sarah's emergence from the mine that afternoon marked the end of her role as an amateur historian pursuing a personal interest in local folklore. Whether she realized it or not, she had become the discoverer of evidence that would challenge established historical understanding and force academics to confront the possibility that their knowledge of Spanish exploration patterns was incomplete. The ornate chest waiting in the carved chamber represented proof that legends sometimes contained more truth than scholars were willing to acknowledge. The drive home from the mine gave Sarah time to consider the implications of what she had discovered, and to plan her approach for presenting the evidence in ways that would command serious attention from professional archaeologists. The carved chamber had been impressive but dismissible. The ornate chest was undeniable physical proof that would require investigation regardless of personal opinions about the likelihood of Spanish colonial mining in northern Colorado. Sarah's discovery was about to transform her from a local eccentric, pursuing questionable theories, into a serious researcher whose findings demanded professional investigation. The skeptics who had dismissed her previous work would soon be forced to acknowledge that sometimes amateur historians uncover evidence that professionals have overlooked, and that conventional wisdom about historical possibilities isn't always supported by the full range of available evidence. The ornate chest buried in the carved chamber represented more than just validation of Sarah's theories about Spanish colonial mining activity. It was proof that determination, Systematic research and willingness to challenge accepted wisdom could lead to discoveries that rewrote historical understanding and forced experts to expand their conception of what was historically possible. In the American West, Sarah's dining room table had been transformed into a makeshift archaeological laboratory, with high-resolution photographs of the ornate chest arranged in precise chronological order, alongside detailed sketches, measurement, charts, and historical reference materials. She had spent 3 sleepless nights analyzing every visible detail of her discovery, cross-referencing decorative motifs with Spanish colonial metalwork patterns documented in university library databases. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, yet Sarah knew that presenting her findings would trigger a level of institutional resistance that could make her previous encounters with skepticism seem trivial by comparison. The chest's decorative elements showed clear Spanish colonial craftsmanship dating to the late 16th or early 17th century, with religious symbols and royal insignia that identified it as an official expedition container rather than personal luggage or commercial equipment. The combination of Christian crosses, Spanish royal lions, and what appeared to be territorial marking symbols suggested that the chest had been used to store important documents, valuable materials, or both during an official Spanish colonial expedition into territories that historians insisted had never been explored by conquistadors. Sarah's research into Spanish colonial exploration patterns had revealed that official expeditions typically carried multiple containers for different types of materials, with specially designed chests reserved for the most valuable discoveries and important documentation. The ornate chest she had discovered in the Esperanza mine appeared to match specifications for containers used to transport precious metals, religious artifacts, and territorial claim documents back to Spanish colonial authorities. If her analysis was correct, the chest might contain evidence that would revolutionize understanding of Spanish exploration patterns throughout the American West. However, Sarah's growing excitement about the historical significance of her discovery was tempered by her realistic assessment of the challenges she would face in convincing professional archaeologists to take her findings seriously. Her previous experience with local historians had demonstrated the powerful resistance that established experts showed toward evidence that contradicted their accepted understanding of regional history. An amateur teenager claiming to have discovered proof of previously unknown Spanish colonial activity would face even more intense skepticism from academics whose careers were built on existing historical frameworks. Sarah's first attempt to engage professional archaeological expertise came through a carefully composed email to Dr. Patricia Valdez, a Spanish colonial history specialist at the University of Colorado, whose published research focused on conquistador exploration patterns throughout the Southwest. Sarah's message included her best photographs of the ornate chest, detailed documentation of its location and archaeological context, and a thorough analysis of the decorative elements that suggested Spanish colonial origins. Dr. Valdez's response arrived within 24 hours, but its tone was far more dismissive than Sarah had anticipated from a professional historian examining potentially significant archaeological evidence. "While I appreciate your enthusiasm for historical research," Dr. Valdez wrote, "claims about Spanish colonial artifacts in northern Colorado require extraordinary verification before they can be taken seriously by the academic community. Amateur discoveries are frequently misidentified due to lack of proper training in artifact analysis and historical context." The professor's message continued with a brief lecture about the documented boundaries of Spanish colonial exploration, emphasizing that no credible evidence existed for conquistador activity in the specific region where Sarah claimed to have made her discovery. Dr. Valdez concluded by suggesting that Sarah contact local historical societies or amateur archaeology clubs that might be better equipped to provide guidance appropriate for her level of expertise and training. The condescending tone of Dr. Valdez's response was infuriating, particularly because the professor had clearly not examined Sarah's photographic evidence with any serious attention to detail before rendering her judgment. The dismissal seemed based entirely on preconceived notions about what was historically possible, rather than on any actual analysis of the physical evidence Sarah had presented. The suggestion that she seek guidance from amateur clubs felt like a deliberate insult designed to discourage further contact with professional archaeologists. However, Sarah's commitment to uncovering historical truth remained stronger than her frustration with institutional resistance. The carved chamber and ornate chest were undeniable evidence that the Esperanza mine contained artifacts of immense historical significance, even if professional archaeologists were unwilling to investigate them properly. Her documentation was thorough and her analysis was sound, regardless of what experts claimed about the impossibility of Spanish colonial mining in her region. Sarah realized that overcoming institutional resistance would require more than presenting evidence to people who had already decided that her discoveries were impossible. She needed to find allies who shared her commitment to historical truth rather than institutional convenience, experts who would examine her evidence with open minds rather than predetermined conclusions. The ornate chest waiting in the carved chamber deserved proper investigation by archaeologists who valued discovery over dogma. The stage was set for Sarah's next phase of research, which would require her to venture even deeper into the dangerous sections of the Esperanza mine in search of evidence so compelling that even the most skeptical experts would be forced to acknowledge the significance of her discoveries. The weight of constant rejection pressed down on Sarah's shoulders as she sat in her bedroom, surrounded by printed emails from archaeology professors, each message a variation on the same theme of polite dismissal and academic condescension. 3 months had passed since her discovery of the ornate chest, and her systematic attempts to engage professional expertise had yielded nothing but frustration and increasingly personal attacks on her credibility. The stack of rejection letters had grown thick enough to fill a manila folder, each one representing another expert who had chosen institutional comfort over intellectual curiosity. Sarah found herself questioning everything she had believed about the academic pursuit of knowledge and the supposed objectivity of scientific inquiry. Her naive assumption that presenting compelling evidence would automatically generate serious investigation had been shattered by encounters with scholars who seemed more interested in protecting established theories than discovering historical truth. The pattern was so consistent that Sarah had begun to wonder whether the problem lay not with her evidence, but with her fundamental understanding of how professional archaeology actually operated. The psychological toll of constant rejection was manifesting in ways that concerned Sarah's parents and teachers. Her previously excellent grades had begun to slip as she devoted increasing amounts of time to refining her documentation and researching new approaches for presenting her findings. Her participation in school activities had declined dramatically, and her few close friendships had suffered as her obsession with the Esperanza mine consumed more of her emotional energy. Sleep had become elusive as her mind raced with strategies for overcoming institutional resistance that seemed designed to prevent rather than encourage genuine discovery. Mrs. Patterson's expression during their latest conference reflected the kind of concerned disappointment that teachers reserved for promising students who were throwing away their potential. The history teacher had requested a private meeting to discuss Sarah's declining academic performance and what she perceived as an unhealthy fixation on theories that were damaging her educational prospects. "Sarah, I need you to understand that your college applications are due in 6 months, and your current trajectory is going to hurt your chances of getting into a good university," Mrs. Patterson said with the patient tone she used for difficult conversations. "Admissions committees want to see students who can distinguish between legitimate academic research and personal obsessions that interfere with their educational development." The characterization of her archaeological discoveries as personal obsessions was deeply insulting, particularly coming from an educator who should have appreciated the significance of original historical research. Sarah had spent years developing expertise in Spanish colonial history, mastering archaeological documentation techniques, and producing evidence that would be considered remarkable if it had been discovered by professional researchers. The fact that her amateur status somehow invalidated the quality of her work reflected the kind of credentialism that prevented genuine discoveries from receiving proper recognition. "Mrs. Patterson, I found physical evidence that challenges established historical understanding of Spanish exploration patterns," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her frustration. "Isn't that exactly the kind of original research that colleges claim to value in their applicants?" Mrs. Patterson's sigh suggested that she had anticipated this response and prepared her counter-arguments in advance. "Sarah, original research requires peer review and expert validation. When every professional archaeologist tells you that your theories are wrong, continuing to pursue them demonstrates poor judgment rather than scholarly dedication. College admissions committees will see this pattern as evidence that you lack the intellectual maturity to succeed in higher education." The circular logic of Mrs. Patterson's argument was maddening. Professional archaeologists refused to examine Sarah's evidence because they considered her theories impossible, but their refusal to investigate was then used as proof that her theories were invalid. The system seemed designed to prevent challenges to established understanding, rather than to encourage the kind of intellectual inquiry that supposedly drove academic progress. Sarah's attempts to explain the quality of her evidence and the systematic nature of her research were met with increasingly impatient responses from Mrs. Patterson, who seemed to view the conversation as an intervention designed to save a promising student from self-destructive behavior. The teacher's obvious conviction that Sarah was deluding herself made meaningful dialogue impossible, as every piece of evidence was interpreted through the lens of predetermined conclusions about what was historically possible. "I think you need to consider the possibility that your emotional investment in these theories is preventing you from seeing them objectively," Mrs. Patterson said, with the gentle firmness that counselors used when delivering unwelcome truths. "Sometimes the most difficult part of growing up is learning to let go of ideas that make us feel special but aren't supported by reality." The suggestion that her archaeological research was motivated by a need to feel special rather than by genuine intellectual curiosity was perhaps the most hurtful dismissal Sarah had encountered. Her years of systematic exploration and careful documentation had been driven by passionate interest in historical truth, not by any desire for personal recognition or social status. The teacher's psychological interpretation of her motivations revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what drove serious historical research. Sarah's isolation was compounded by the reaction of her few remaining friends, who had initially been supportive of her unusual hobby, but were growing tired of her constant focus on archaeological evidence that they couldn't understand or verify. Jessica Martinez, who had been Sarah's closest friend since middle school, expressed concern during A lunch conversation that reflected the broader community's growing impatience with Sarah's controversial research. "Sarah, I know this mind stuff is important to you, but it's like you can't talk about anything else anymore," Jessica said with the careful tone friends used when delivering criticism they hoped would be constructive. "Everyone's worried that you're becoming obsessed with something that's not even real. Maybe it's time to find some other interests that don't make people think you're losing touch with reality." The suggestion that her discoveries weren't real, despite overwhelming photographic and physical evidence, demonstrated how thoroughly the community's skepticism had influenced even Sarah's closest relationships. Jessica's concern was well-intentioned, but reflected the kind of social pressure that forced unconventional thinkers to choose between their intellectual integrity and their social connections. The implicit ultimatum was clear: abandon her research or accept increasing isolation from the community that had known her since childhood. Sarah's parents were struggling with their own version of this dilemma as they watched their daughters' academic and social life suffer from her determination to prove theories that every expert claimed were impossible. David Chen's background in geology gave him some appreciation for the quality of Sarah's archaeological documentation, but his career in academia had taught him to respect professional expertise and peer review processes. Lynn's research skills had helped Sarah analyze historical documents and Spanish colonial records, but her practical nature made her increasingly concerned about the costs of challenging established institutional authority. "Sweetheart, we're proud of your dedication and the quality of your research, but we're worried about the price you're paying for this battle," David said during a family dinner conversation that had become increasingly frequent as Sarah's situation deteriorated. "Sometimes being right isn't enough if you can't convince the people who need to validate your work. Maybe it's time to consider whether this fight is worth what it's costing you." The suggestion that she should abandon her research because professional archaeologists were unwilling to examine her evidence felt like a betrayal of everything her parents had taught her about intellectual integrity and scientific inquiry. Sarah had approached her discoveries with the systematic methodology that David had taught her, had documented her findings with the careful attention to detail that Lynn had modeled in her library research. Yet now, both parents seemed to be suggesting that institutional approval was more important than empirical evidence. "You taught me that good research speaks for itself," Sarah replied, trying to keep the hurt out of her voice. "You said that evidence matters more than opinion. That's systematic. Investigation reveals truth, regardless of what people want to believe. Now you're telling me to ignore my own evidence because experts won't examine it." The pain in her parents' faces reflected their genuine conflict between supporting their daughter's intellectual courage and protecting her from the practical consequences of challenging institutional authority. Their careers had taught them that academic success required working within established systems rather than against them. But their daughter's discoveries seemed to demand exactly the kind of revolutionary thinking that institutions were designed to resist. Sarah's sense of isolation deepened as she realized that even her most supportive allies were beginning to question whether her commitment to uncovering historical truth was worth the personal and academic costs she was paying. The loneliness was crushing, made worse by her growing awareness that the evidence waiting in the Esperanza mine deserved investigation regardless of institutional resistance or social pressure. The ornate chest and carved chamber represented historical discoveries of genuine significance, yet she seemed to be the only person willing to acknowledge their importance. The breaking point came during a guidance counselor meeting designed to discuss Sarah's college application strategy. Mr. Rodriguez had reviewed her academic record, her declining grades, and the comments from teachers who were concerned about her unhealthy obsession with archaeological theories that professional experts had dismissed as impossible. "Sarah, you're a bright student with a lot of potential, But your college applications need to show balance and good judgment, Rodriguez said while reviewing her file. This fixation on old mines and Spanish treasure stories is going to be a red flag for admissions committees. They want students who can think critically and accept expert guidance, not teenagers who think they know better than professional archaeologists. The characterization of her systematic archaeological research as Spanish treasure stories was the final insult in a series of dismissals that had worn down Sarah's confidence and made her question her own judgment. She had spent years developing genuine expertise in Spanish colonial history and archaeological methodology, had produced documentation that would impress professional researchers if they were willing to examine it. Yet every authority figure seemed determined to reduce her work to childish fantasy. What if the experts are wrong? Sarah asked quietly, voicing the question that had been growing stronger despite months of institutional resistance. What if their refusal to examine my evidence is preventing important historical discoveries from being properly investigated? Rodriguez's patient smile suggested that he had encountered this kind of teenage rebellion against authority before and knew how to handle it. Sarah, that's exactly the kind of thinking that's going to hurt your college prospects. Academic success requires learning to work within established systems and respecting professional expertise. You can't build a career by constantly challenging people who know more than you do. The counselor's response crystallized Sarah's growing understanding that the institutional resistance she faced wasn't based on careful evaluation of her evidence, but on systematic bias against challenges to established authority. The message was clear: conform to accepted understanding or face academic and social consequences that would damage her future prospects. The choice between intellectual integrity and institutional approval had become stark and unavoidable. Sarah left the guidance counselor's office with a profound sense of isolation that went beyond her specific situation to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, authority, and truth. Her discoveries in the Esperanza mine were real and significant, regardless of what experts claimed about their impossibility. Yet she seemed to be entirely alone in recognizing their importance. The weight of being the sole guardian of historical evidence that deserved professional investigation was becoming unbearable. That evening, Sarah sat in her bedroom staring at photographs of the ornate chest while contemplating her increasingly limited options. She could abandon her research and focus on conventional academic pursuits that would satisfy teachers, counselors, and college admissions committees. Or she could continue fighting an apparently hopeless battle against institutional resistance that seemed designed to prevent rather than encourage genuine discovery. The choice felt like a test of her fundamental character and values. The sound of her parents' worried conversation drifting up from the kitchen reminded Sarah that her decisions affected more than just her own future. David and Lynn had invested their hopes and resources in their daughter's education, and her controversial archaeological research was threatening to undermine everything they had worked to provide for her. The weight of their expectations added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. Sarah's reflection was interrupted by an email notification that would change the trajectory of her research and provide the first glimmer of hope she had experienced in months of institutional rejection and personal isolation. The email notification chimed softly in the darkness of Sarah's bedroom, interrupting her contemplation of what felt like an impossible choice between intellectual integrity and academic survival. She almost ignored the message, expecting another polite rejection from a university archaeology department, or perhaps another concerned note from a teacher worried about her declining performance. Instead, the sender's name made her pulse quicken. With unexpected hope, Dr. Elena Castillo, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Colonial Studies in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Sarah had contacted Dr. Castillo 3 weeks earlier as part of her systematic outreach to Spanish colonial history experts throughout the Southwest. Unlike the other academics who had dismissed her claims without serious examination, Dr. Castillo had requested additional documentation and asked detailed questions about the archaeological context of Sarah's discoveries. The thoroughness of her initial response had suggested genuine interest rather than polite dismissal, but Sarah had begun to assume that even this promising contact would ultimately result in another rejection. Dr. Castillo's email was lengthy and detailed, beginning with an apology for the delayed response that immediately set a different tone from the brief, dismissive messages Sarah had grown accustomed to receiving from academic experts. "I want to apologize for taking so long to respond to your fascinating documentation," Dr. Castillo wrote. "Your photographs and analysis required careful study, and I wanted to consult with several colleagues who specialize in Spanish colonial metalwork and mining operations before providing you with a thoughtful response." The fact that Dr. Castillo had actually studied Sarah's evidence and consulted with other experts was itself remarkable, representing the first instance of serious academic engagement she had encountered in months of attempted outreach. The professor's willingness to invest time and professional resources in examining an amateur's claims suggested an approach to scholarship that prioritized evidence over institutional bias. "Your documentation of the carved chamber and ornate chest is genuinely impressive," Dr. Castillo continued. "The photographic quality is excellent, your measurements appear accurate, and your analysis of the decorative elements shows sophisticated understanding of Spanish colonial artistic conventions. More importantly, several details in your photographs match specific design elements that I've encountered in authenticated Spanish colonial artifacts from the late 16th century." Sarah's hands trembled as she read Dr. Castillo's technical analysis of the ornate chest's decorative elements. The professor had identified specific symbols and construction techniques that corresponded to documented Spanish colonial practices, providing the kind of expert validation that Sarah had been desperately seeking for months. The detailed comparison between her discovery and authenticated artifacts from the same historical period offered compelling evidence that the Esperanza mine chest was genuine rather than a modern reproduction or misidentified American mining equipment. The combination of religious symbols, royal insignia, and territorial markers visible in your photographs is consistent with official Spanish colonial expedition containers used to transport valuable discoveries and important documentation, Dr. Castillo explained. The specific arrangement of crosses, lions, and geometric patterns follows conventions established by Spanish colonial authorities for marking containers that held materials destined for royal inspection. Dr. Castillo's analysis went beyond simply validating Sarah's identification of the chest as a Spanish colonial artifact. The professor's expertise in colonial exploration patterns allowed her to place Sarah's discovery within the broader context of Spanish territorial expansion and mineral extraction operations throughout the American Southwest. Her email included detailed background information about Spanish colonial mining techniques, expedition organization, and documentation practices that provided crucial context for understanding the significance of the Esperanza mine discoveries. What makes your findings particularly intriguing is their location in a region that current historical understanding considers outside the documented range of Spanish colonial mining operations, Dr. Castillo wrote. However, recent archival research has uncovered references to Spanish expeditions that pushed much farther north than previously recognized, including several mentions of mining operations in territories that correspond to your general geographic region. The revelation that recent archival research supported the possibility of Spanish colonial activity in northern Colorado was electrifying for Sarah, who had spent months being told that her theories contradicted established historical understanding. Dr. Castillo's email suggested that the historical understanding was itself incomplete, based on limited documentation rather than comprehensive knowledge of Spanish colonial exploration patterns. Dr. Castillo's message included attachments containing recently discovered Spanish colonial documents that referenced mining expeditions into territories that had been considered unexplored by conquistadors. The archival materials were fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but they contained enough geographic references to suggest that Spanish colonial authorities had been aware of mineral deposits in regions far north of their documented territorial boundaries. One document from the Seville archives mentions a mining expedition led by Captain Francisco de Mendoza in 1594 that was tasked with investigating reports of rich silver deposits in territories beyond the Great Mountains of the northern frontier, Dr. Castillo explained. The expedition's final report has never been located, but supply records indicate that they were equipped for extended operations in remote territories and carried containers designed for transporting valuable discoveries back to colonial authorities. The historical context provided by Dr. Castillo's research transformed Sarah's discoveries from isolated anomalies into parts of a larger pattern of Spanish colonial activity that had been hidden by incomplete historical records. The possibility that Captain Mendoza's expedition had reached the Colorado Rockies and established mining operations in the Esperanza region provided a plausible explanation for the artifacts Sarah had discovered. Most importantly, Dr. Castillo's email included an invitation that Sarah had never dared to hope for, despite months of rejection and dismissal from academic experts. Given the potential significance of your discoveries, I would like to propose a collaboration that could benefit both your research and our institute's ongoing work on Spanish colonial mining operations, the professor wrote. If you're willing to work with professional archaeologists, we could organize a proper expedition to investigate the Esperanza mine using standard archaeological protocols. The offer of professional collaboration represented everything Sarah had been seeking since her first discovery of the carved chamber. Dr. Castillo was proposing exactly the kind of systematic investigation that would provide definitive answers about the historical significance of the Esperanza mine while protecting the integrity of any artifacts that might be uncovered. The prospect of working with experienced archaeologists who shared her commitment to uncovering historical truth was almost too good to believe. I should be clear that such an expedition would require careful planning, proper permits, and significant resources, Dr. Castillo continued. However, the Institute for Colonial Studies has both the expertise and funding necessary to conduct a thorough investigation if your discoveries prove to be as significant as your documentation suggests. The first step would be for me to visit the site personally, to assess the archaeological potential and verify the authenticity of the artifacts you've documented. Dr. Castillo's offer to visit the Esperanza mine in person was the validation Sarah had been craving throughout her months of institutional rejection. A respected expert in Spanish colonial history was willing to examine her evidence firsthand, rather than dismissing it based on preconceived assumptions about what was historically possible. The professor's approach represented genuine scientific inquiry, rather than the institutional bias that had characterized every other academic response Sarah had encountered. The email concluded with practical details about organizing Dr. Castillo's visit to Colorado and preliminary steps for obtaining the permits and approvals that would be necessary for a professional archaeological expedition. The professor's tone was businesslike and professional, treating Sarah as a serious researcher whose discoveries merited thorough investigation rather than as an amateur whose claims could be dismissed without examination. Sarah read Dr. Castillo's email 3 times before fully absorbing its implications for her research and her future. After months of rejection and isolation, she had finally found an academic ally who recognized the potential significance of her discoveries and was willing to provide the professional expertise necessary to investigate them properly. The professor's offer of collaboration represented not just validation of Sarah's work, but the possibility of transforming her amateur research into a legitimate archaeological expedition. The relief Sarah felt at receiving Dr. Castillo's email was overwhelming, bringing tears to her eyes as she realized that her faith in the significance of her discoveries had been justified despite the consistent rejection she had faced from other experts. The ornate chest waiting in the carved chamber would finally receive the professional investigation it deserved, and the historical questions raised by her findings would be addressed using proper archaeological methods and resources. However, Sarah's excitement about Dr. Castillo's offer was tempered by her awareness of the practical obstacles that would need to be overcome before any professional expedition could take place. Her parents would need to approve her involvement in what could be a dangerous and time-consuming archaeological project, and she would need to find ways to balance her participation in professional research with her academic responsibilities and college preparation requirements. More significantly, Sarah realized that accepting Dr. Castillo's offer would inevitably bring her discoveries to the attention of the broader archaeological community, including the experts who had previously dismissed her claims. The professional validation she craved would come at the cost of privacy and control over her research, as the Esperanza mine would become a legitimate archaeological site subject to academic scrutiny and potential controversy. The prospect of facing renewed skepticism from the archaeological establishment was daunting, but Sarah recognized that professional collaboration was essential for uncovering the full historical significance of her discoveries. Dr. Castillo's expertise and institutional resources could provide answers to questions that were beyond Sarah's amateur capabilities, while the professor's academic credentials would lend credibility to findings that had been dismissed when presented by a high school student. Sarah's response to Dr. Castillo was carefully composed to convey both her excitement about the collaboration and her understanding of the serious responsibilities that would come with professional archaeological investigation. She provided additional documentation that the professor had requested, including detailed maps of the mine's tunnel system and comprehensive photographs of the carved chamber's decorative elements. "I would be honored to collaborate with you and the Institute for Colonial Studies in investigating the Esperanza mine," Sarah wrote. "I understand that professional archaeological work requires systematic methodology and proper protocols, and I'm committed to supporting your research in whatever capacity would be most helpful. The discoveries waiting in the mine deserve investigation by experts with the knowledge and resources to properly analyze their historical significance." Sarah's email to Dr. Castillo marked the end of her isolation as an amateur researcher fighting alone against institutional skepticism. The professor's willingness to take her discoveries seriously had transformed her from a controversial teenager pursuing questionable theories into a collaborator in legitimate archaeological research. The validation was intoxicating, but Sarah understood that the real work was just beginning. The ornate chest buried in the carved chamber represented only a small part of what might be waiting in the deepest sections of the Esperanza mine, and Dr. Castillo's expertise would be essential for uncovering evidence that could revolutionize understanding of Spanish colonial exploration patterns. Sarah's amateur research had raised fascinating questions about the extent of conquistador activity in the American West. But answering those questions would require the systematic investigation that only professional archaeologists could provide. The stage was set for Sarah's transformation from isolated amateur to recognized collaborator in one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Colorado history. Dr. Castillo's arrival in Millbrook Valley 3 weeks later created a sensation that rippled through the small farming community like a stone dropped into still water. The professor's rental car, loaded with professional archaeological equipment and followed by a graduate student driving a second vehicle packed with documentation materials, represented the first serious academic attention the region had received in decades. Sarah watched from her bedroom window as the convoy turned into their gravel driveway, her stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation that had been building since confirming the professor's visit. The woman who emerged from the lead vehicle bore little resemblance to Sarah's mental image of a distinguished academic researcher. Dr. Elena Castillo was younger than expected, perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested someone more comfortable in the field than in lecture halls. Her handshake was firm and direct, her manner businesslike but warm, and her immediate questions about the mine's accessibility demonstrated the kind of practical focus that Sarah had learned to associate with serious professionals rather than theoretical academics. Sarah, I want you to know that your documentation is among the most thorough amateur archaeological work I've encountered in 20 years of professional research, Dr. Castillo said, as they stood in the Chen family's living room surrounded by Sarah's carefully organized photographs, maps, and analysis materials. Your systematic approach to recording evidence and your attention to historical context showed genuine understanding of proper research methodology. The validation from a respected expert was almost overwhelming for Sarah, who had grown accustomed to having her work dismissed or patronized by authority figures who questioned her competence and judgment. Dr. Castillo's acknowledgement of her research quality represented the kind of professional recognition that Sarah had been seeking since her first discovery of the carved chamber. The professor's respectful treatment of her work as legitimate scholarship rather than amateur speculation was itself a form of victory after months of institutional dismissal. Dr. Castillo's graduate student Miguel Santos was a doctoral candidate, specializing in Spanish colonial mining operations, whose master's thesis had focused on conquistador exploration patterns throughout the American Southwest. His expertise in historical mining techniques and artifact analysis would provide crucial support for the preliminary investigation that Dr. Castillo was planning. Miguel's enthusiasm for Sarah's discoveries was evident in his detailed questions about the carved chamber's construction and the ornate chest's decorative elements. The combination of religious and royal symbols you've documented is fascinating, Miguel explained as he studied Sarah's photographs with a magnifying glass designed for examining fine details in historical artifacts. The specific arrangement suggests this was an official expedition container rather than personal equipment, which would make it incredibly valuable both as a historical artifact and as evidence for previously undocumented Spanish colonial activity in this region. The professional analysis of her photographic evidence by experts who understood Spanish colonial history was revelatory for Sarah, who had spent months receiving dismissive responses from academics who had never bothered to examine her documentation carefully. Dr. Castillo and Miguel approached her discoveries with the kind of systematic attention to detail that Sarah had always believed her evidence deserved, treating each photograph and measurement as potentially significant rather than as curiosities to be explained away. Sarah's parents had initially been skeptical about allowing their daughter to collaborate with professional archaeologists, worried that such involvement might further damage her academic prospects and social relationships within the community. However, Dr. Castillo's credentials and professional manner had reassured David and Lynn that their daughter's research was being taken seriously by legitimate experts rather than encouraging her to pursue questionable theories that would interfere with her education. "We're proud of Sarah's dedication and the quality of her work, but we've been concerned about the resistance she's encountered from local authorities and academic institutions," David explained to Dr. Castillo during their initial meeting. "If professional archaeologists are genuinely interested in investigating her discoveries, we want to support that research while ensuring that Sarah's college preparation doesn't suffer." Dr. Castillo's response demonstrated her understanding of the concerns that parents naturally had about their child's involvement in potentially controversial archaeological research. "I want to assure you that Sarah's collaboration with our institute will enhance rather than damage her academic prospects," the professor replied. "Participation in legitimate archaeological research is exactly the kind of original scholarship that college admissions committees find impressive, particularly when it involves discoveries of genuine historical significance." The professor's explanation of how Sarah's archaeological work could actually strengthen her college applications represented a complete reversal of the warnings she'd been receiving from teachers and guidance counselors who viewed her research as a liability. Dr. Castillo's perspective suggested that the problem lay not with Sarah's dedication to her discoveries, but with local authorities who lacked the expertise to recognize legitimate archaeological research when they encountered it. The preliminary examination of the Esperanza mine was scheduled for the following morning, with Dr. Castillo and Miguel planning to spend several hours investigating the carved chamber and documenting the ornate chest using professional archaeological equipment. Sarah would serve as their guide through the mine's complex tunnel system, drawing on her years of exploration experience to navigate the safest routes to the deepest accessible sections. However, the night before their scheduled expedition brought unexpected complications that threatened to derail the professional investigation before it could begin. Harold Brennan appeared at the Chen family's door shortly after dinner, accompanied by Sheriff Morrison and 2 other members of the county Historical Society board. Their expressions were grim, and their manner suggested official business rather than a social visit. "David, we need to discuss this situation with the archaeological people," Brennan began, without preamble, his tone carrying the weight of community authority that local officials wielded in small towns. "There are serious concerns about bringing outside researchers into our community to investigate claims that our own experts have already determined to be unfounded." Sheriff Morrison's presence at what was ostensibly a historical society matter suggested that Brennan's concerns extended beyond academic disagreements into questions of legal authority and community control. The sheriff's involvement implied that Sarah's collaboration with professional archaeologists was being viewed as some kind of threat to local interests, rather than as legitimate scholarly research. "I understand there are people here from some institute in New Mexico," Morrison said, consulting a small notebook as if he were investigating a potential crime. "They don't have permits to conduct excavations on private property, and they certainly don't have authorization to remove artifacts from archaeological sites. If they're planning to disturb anything in that old mine, they need to understand that there could be legal consequences," The suggestion that Dr. Castillo and Miguel were somehow operating illegally was absurd, as they had made no plans to excavate or remove artifacts without proper permits and authorization. Their preliminary investigation was designed to assess the archaeological potential of the site and verify the authenticity of Sarah's discoveries, not to conduct the kind of systematic excavation that would require special permits and legal oversight. Dr. Castillo's response to the unexpected visit was diplomatically professional, demonstrating the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with bureaucratic challenges and territorial disputes. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern for proper archaeological protocols," she said with careful courtesy. "Our preliminary investigation tomorrow involves only visual inspection and photographic documentation, which doesn't require special permits or legal authorization. Any future excavation would naturally involve full compliance with all applicable regulations and proper coordination with local authorities." Brennan's expression suggested that he had expected more resistance from the visiting archaeologists and wasn't sure how to respond to Dr. Castillo's reasonable assurances about legal compliance. His original objections seemed based more on territorial concerns about outside experts validating Sarah's controversial theories than on legitimate questions about archaeological protocols. "The issue isn't just about permits," Brennan continued, his tone revealing the underlying political concerns that had motivated the evening visit. "This community has its own historical society with established expertise in regional history. Bringing in outside researchers to investigate claims that our local experts have already evaluated sends the wrong message about our competence and authority." The territorial nature of Brennan's objections became clear as he explained his concerns about outside validation of discoveries that local historians had dismissed. The issue wasn't whether Sarah's findings were authentic or significant, but whether professional archaeologists had the right to challenge the judgment of local authorities who had invested their reputations in debunking her theories. Dr. Castillo's diplomatic response acknowledged Brennan's concerns, while firmly establishing her right to conduct legitimate archaeological research. "I have great respect for local historical societies and the valuable work they do in preserving regional heritage," she said carefully. "However, archaeological investigation is a specialized field that requires specific training and expertise. Our interest in this site reflects its potential significance for understanding Spanish colonial history, not any judgment about local competence or authority." The professor's explanation of the distinction between local historical preservation and professional archaeological research was lost on Brennan, who seemed to view any outside involvement as an implicit criticism of local expertise. His resistance reflected the kind of provincial defensiveness that often emerged when small communities encountered challenges to their established understanding of their own history and significance. Miguel's attempt to diffuse the tension by explaining the broader historical importance of Spanish colonial research met with similar resistance from the delegation of local officials. The possibility of documented Spanish colonial mining activity in this region could revolutionize understanding of conquistador exploration patterns throughout the American West, he explained enthusiastically. If Sarah's discoveries are authentic, they represent evidence that historians have been seeking for decades. Sheriff Morrison's skeptical response revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of how archaeological research operated. "If this stuff was so important, don't you think real archaeologists would have found it already? Seems suspicious that a high school kid would discover something that all the experts missed." The sheriff's logic reflected the kind of circular reasoning that had characterized much of the institutional resistance Sarah had encountered. Professional archaeologists couldn't have missed important discoveries because important discoveries would have been found by professional archaeologists. The possibility that systematic archaeological survey had never been conducted in the Esperanza mine region was apparently inconceivable to local authorities who assumed that their area had received thorough academic attention. Dr. Castillo's patient explanation of how archaeological discoveries actually occurred did little to reassure the visiting delegation. Most significant archaeological finds are made by amateur researchers, local residents, or construction workers who encounter artifacts during routine activities, she pointed out. Professional archaeologists then investigate these discoveries, using systematic methods to determine their historical significance. Sarah's work follows exactly this pattern of amateur discovery followed by professional investigation. The evening's confrontation concluded with an uneasy truce that allowed Dr. Castillo and Miguel to proceed with their preliminary investigation while establishing clear boundaries about what local authorities would accept. The visitors could examine and photograph Sarah's discoveries, but any talk of major excavations or removal of artifacts would require extensive consultation with local officials and compliance with regulations that Brennan seemed prepared to interpret very strictly. Sarah realized that the resistance she had encountered from local authorities was about to intensify now that professional archaeologists were taking her discoveries seriously. The validation she had craved was coming at the cost of making her research a community controversy that extended far beyond questions of historical accuracy into issues of local pride, territorial authority, and political control. The stage was set for a confrontation between amateur discovery and institutional resistance, between professional expertise and local authority, between the pursuit of historical truth and the protection of established interests. Sarah's collaboration with Dr. Castillo had transformed her from an isolated teenager into the center of a conflict that would test everyone's commitment to genuine scholarly inquiry. The descent into the Esperanza mine the following morning felt like a journey through time itself, with each level revealing different eras of human ambition and technological capability. Dr. Castillo moved through the tunnels with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to working in challenging underground environments, while Miguel documented their progress with professional-grade photography equipment that captured details invisible to amateur documentation. Sarah served as their guide through the complex network of passages, drawing on years of exploration experience to navigate the safest routes toward the carved chamber that had started everything. The contrast between Dr. Castillo's systematic approach and Sarah's previous amateur explorations was immediately apparent as the professor examined each section of tunnel with trained eyes that could read the story written in tool marks, construction techniques, and geological formations. Where Sarah had seen interesting variations in mining methods, Dr. Castillo recognized specific cultural and technological signatures that revealed when and how different sections had been excavated. These upper tunnels show typical American mining techniques from the 1870s, Dr. Castillo explained, as she examined the angular cuts and systematic grid patterns that characterize the mine's primary workings. The tool marks are consistent with steel implements. The support structures follow standard engineering practices of the period, and the overall layout prioritizes efficient ore extraction over aesthetic considerations. Miguel's documentation of the American sections was thorough but routine, confirming what historical records already indicated about 19th-century mining operations in the region. The real excitement began as they descended toward the deeper levels where Sarah's discoveries awaited professional examination. The transition from American to Spanish construction methods was gradual but unmistakable, with subtle changes in technique that became more pronounced as they moved further from the mine's primary workings. The shift in construction methods is remarkable, Dr. Castillo observed as they reached tunnels that showed clear evidence of much older excavation techniques. These passages were carved with completely different tools, using approaches that prioritize structural integrity and longevity over rapid extraction. The workmanship suggests builders who expected these tunnels to be used for extended periods, rather than abandoned once easily accessible ore was exhausted. The professor's analysis confirmed what Sarah had suspected during her years of amateur exploration. The deeper sections of the mine had been worked by people with fundamentally different priorities and capabilities than the American prospectors who had reopened it in the 1870s. The Spanish construction showed sophisticated understanding of geology and engineering that seemed inconsistent with conventional assumptions about 16th-century mining technology. Sarah's navigation through the increasingly treacherous passages demonstrated the intimate knowledge of the mine's layout that she had developed through systematic exploration. Her ability to identify stable routes through areas where tunnel supports had deteriorated impressed both professional archaeologists who recognized the dangers involved in solo exploration of abandoned mining sites. The risks Sarah had taken to document her discoveries became apparent as they encountered sections where structural instability made passage genuinely hazardous. Sarah, I need you to understand that what you've accomplished here represents years of dangerous work that most professional archaeologists wouldn't attempt without extensive safety support, Dr. Castillo said as they paused at a particularly unstable section. Your documentation of these deep tunnels required courage and skill that goes far beyond typical amateur research. The acknowledgement of the risks Sarah had taken to uncover her discoveries was gratifying, particularly coming from an expert who understood the genuine dangers involved in underground exploration. Her years of careful preparation and systematic approach to safety had been dismissed by local authorities who viewed her work as reckless teenage adventure rather than serious archaeological research. Dr. Castillo's recognition of her competence and courage validated the professionalism that Sarah had tried to bring to her explorations. The approach to the collapsed passage that led to the carved chamber required careful assessment of structural stability before attempting the dangerous crawl through unstable debris. Dr. Castillo examined the rockfall with experienced eyes, evaluating the risks against the potential archaeological rewards of reaching the chamber beyond. Her decision to proceed demonstrated the kind of calculated risk-taking that characterized serious archaeological fieldwork. The passage is marginal but navigable if we're extremely careful about weight distribution and movement, Dr. Castillo concluded after her structural assessment. Miguel, you'll stay at this end to monitor stability and assist if we encounter problems. Sarah and I will proceed to the chamber, but will maintain constant communication and retreat immediately if conditions deteriorate. The crawl through the collapsed passage was even more harrowing, with Dr. Castillo following behind Sarah, as the professor's additional weight created new stresses on already unstable supports. Sarah's intimate knowledge of the passage's safest route was crucial for navigating around the most dangerous sections, while Dr. Castillo's experience with underground hazards helped identify potential problems before they became critical. That emergence into the carved chamber was a moment of professional validation that justified every risk Sarah had taken to document her discoveries. Dr. Castillo's gasp of amazement as her headlamp illuminated the decorated walls confirmed that Sarah's amateur assessment of the chamber's significance had been absolutely correct. The professor's Immediate recognition of Spanish colonial artistic conventions provided the expert confirmation that months of institutional rejection had failed to provide. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Castillo whispered as she began her systematic examination of the carved symbols. "The craftsmanship is consistent with late 16th century Spanish colonial work, but the iconography includes elements I've never encountered in documented sites. These symbols appear to represent a unique fusion of Spanish colonial conventions with indigenous artistic traditions." The professor's analysis of the carved chamber revealed layers of complexity that Sarah's amateur documentation had missed. Despite her careful attention to detail, Dr. Castillo's expertise in Spanish colonial art history allowed her to identify specific symbols and decorative motifs that connected the Esperanza carvings to documented Spanish colonial sites throughout the American Southwest. The connection suggested that the chamber had been created by craftsmen who were familiar with established artistic conventions but had adapted them for specific local purposes. Miguel's arrival in the chamber after the dangerous passage had been declared stable brought additional expertise in Spanish colonial mining operations that provided crucial context for understanding the chamber's function. His examination of the construction techniques and layout suggested that the space had served as both a working area and a ceremonial center, with practical mining functions combined with religious or administrative purposes. The combination of working surfaces and decorative elements suggests this chamber served multiple functions, Miguel explained as he documented the space with professional archaeological photography. The practical features indicate active mining operations, while the elaborate carvings suggest ceremonial or administrative use that went beyond simple ore extraction. The discovery of the ornate chest generated even more excitement than the carved chamber, as Dr. Castillo's expertise in Spanish colonial metalwork allowed her to identify specific features that confirmed its authenticity and historical significance. The professor's examination revealed details that Sarah's amateur analysis had missed, including maker's marks and construction techniques that could potentially be traced to specific workshops or time periods. The construction methods and decorative elements are absolutely consistent with official Spanish colonial expedition equipment from the late 1500s, Dr. Castillo announced after her careful examination of the chest. The combination of religious symbols, royal insignia and territorial markers identifies this as a container used for transporting valuable discoveries and official documentation back to colonial authorities. The professor's authentication of the ornate chest as a genuine Spanish colonial artifact provided the kind of expert validation that Sarah had been seeking since her initial discovery. Dr. Castillo's credentials and reputation in Spanish colonial studies meant that her assessment would carry weight with the academic community that had previously dismissed Sarah's claims as amateur speculation. However, Dr. Castillo's examination also revealed the chest's extreme fragility and the delicate conservation challenges that would be involved in any attempt to open it or examine its contents. The metal had been severely weakened by centuries of exposure to underground moisture, and the decorative elements were in danger of being lost if the artifact wasn't properly stabilized using professional conservation techniques. Opening this chest will require specialized conservation equipment and controlled laboratory conditions, Dr. Castillo explained as she completed her preliminary documentation. The metal is so fragile that any attempt to examine the contents without proper preparation could result in irreparable damage to both the container and whatever it might hold. The conservation challenges posed by the ornate chest highlighted the limitations of amateur archaeological work and the importance of professional expertise in handling significant historical artifacts. Sarah's careful documentation had preserved crucial information about the discovery, but proper investigation would require resources and techniques that were beyond her capabilities as an amateur researcher. Dr. Castillo's assessment of the carved chamber and ornate chest confirmed that Sarah's discoveries represented archaeological finds of genuine historical significance that demanded professional investigation and conservation. The professor's preliminary examination had validated years of amateur research, while revealing the full scope of what would be required to properly study the Esperanza mine's Spanish colonial remains. Sarah, what you've discovered here has the potential to revolutionize understanding of Spanish colonial exploration patterns throughout the American West, Dr. Castillo said as they prepared to leave the chamber. These artifacts provide physical evidence for Spanish mining operations in regions that historians have considered unexplored by conquistadors. The implications for colonial history are enormous. The professional validation was everything Sarah had hoped for during her months of institutional rejection, but Dr. Castillo's assessment also made clear that her amateur phase of research was coming to an end. The discoveries she had made required professional archaeological investigation that would transform the Esperanza mine from her private research site into a legitimate archaeological project subject to academic scrutiny and bureaucratic oversight. The emergence from the mine that afternoon marked Sarah's transformation from isolated amateur researcher to collaborator in professional archaeological investigation. Dr. Castillo's authentication of her discoveries had vindicated years of systematic exploration while opening new possibilities for understanding Spanish colonial history. However, the professor's plans for comprehensive investigation would inevitably attract the attention of the broader archaeological community, including critics who might challenge findings that contradicted established historical understanding. The stage was set for Sarah's discoveries to receive the professional investigation they deserved, but also for new conflicts with local authorities and academic skeptics who remained committed to protecting established interpretations of regional history against evidence that challenged their fundamental assumptions about Spanish colonial exploration patterns. The euphoria of professional validation lasted exactly 18 hours before the backlash began, with a ferocity that caught even Dr. Castillo off guard. Word of the archaeological team's discoveries had spread through Millbrook Valley's social networks with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve, transforming Sarah's years of patient research into the center of a community controversy that threatened to destroy everything she had worked to accomplish. The phone calls started before dawn, with Harold Brennan demanding an emergency meeting of the County Historical Society Board to address what he termed the crisis of outside interference in our local heritage. Sheriff Morrison's arrival at the Chen family home that morning carried the weight of official authority, though his actual legal jurisdiction over archaeological research remained unclear. His manner suggested someone dealing with a potential crime rather than legitimate scholarly investigation, and his questions about Dr. Castillo's activities implied that professional archaeological work was somehow suspicious or threatening to community interests. I've had complaints from several prominent citizens about these archaeology people disturbing our local historical sites without proper authorization, Morrison announced as he stood in the Chen family's living room, consulting his notebook as if documenting evidence of wrongdoing. There are serious questions about whether they have the legal right to remove artifacts from private property or conduct excavations that could damage important local landmarks. The sheriff's characterization of Dr. Castillo's work as potentially illegal was both inaccurate and inflammatory, designed more to create legal uncertainty than to address legitimate concerns about archaeological protocols. The professor had been scrupulously careful to comply with all applicable regulations, conducting only visual inspection and photographic documentation that required no special permits or legal authorization. Morrison's implications of wrongdoing seemed calculated to undermine the credibility of professional archaeological research, rather than to protect legitimate community interests. Dr. Castillo's response demonstrated the diplomatic skills that had allowed her to navigate similar bureaucratic challenges throughout her career, but her patience was clearly being tested by accusations that questioned her professional integrity. Sheriff Morrison, I want to assure you that our research has complied fully with all applicable laws and regulations, she said with careful courtesy. We have conducted no excavations, removed no artifacts, and damaged no property. Our work consists entirely of documentation and analysis, which requires no special permits under current archaeological regulations. The professor's explanation of proper archaeological protocols was lost on Morrison, who seemed more interested in establishing his authority over the situation than in understanding the legal framework that governed archaeological research. His continued questions about permits and authorizations suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of how legitimate archaeological work operated, combined with a determination to find grounds for challenging the validity of Dr. Castillo's investigation. The real source of community resistance became apparent when Harold Brennan arrived with two other Historical Society board members, their expressions grim with the kind of righteous indignation that characterized people who believed their authority was being challenged by outsiders. Brennan's immediate focus on the implications of Sarah's discoveries for local historical understanding revealed the territorial concerns that were driving the opposition to professional archaeological investigation. This situation has gotten completely out of hand, Brennan declared without preamble, his tone carrying the weight of someone accustomed to having his opinions treated as community consensus. We have outside researchers coming in here, encouraging a teenager's wild theories, and making claims that contradict everything we know about our local history. It's time to put a stop to this nonsense before it damages our community's reputation. The characterization of Sarah's systematic archaeological research as wild theories was particularly insulting, given Dr. Castillo's professional validation of her discoveries. Brennan's objections seemed based more on wounded pride than on legitimate concerns about historical accuracy, reflecting his inability to accept that amateur research had uncovered evidence that local experts had missed. Dr. Castillo's attempt to explain the significance of Sarah's discoveries from a professional archaeological perspective was met with increasingly hostile resistance from the assembled local officials. Sarah's documentation of Spanish colonial artifacts represents potentially groundbreaking evidence for understanding conquistador exploration patterns throughout the American West, the professor explained patiently. These discoveries could revolutionize historical understanding of Spanish colonial mining operations in regions that have been considered unexplored. Brennan's dismissive response revealed the depth of his commitment to protecting established local historical narratives against evidence that challenged their accuracy. We've been studying local history for decades, and there has never been any credible evidence for Spanish colonial activity in this region, he insisted, with the confidence of someone who had never seriously examined the possibility. Just because some teenager finds old junk in an abandoned mine doesn't mean we need to rewrite our history books. The reduction of authenticated Spanish colonial artifacts to old junk demonstrated the willful blindness that characterized institutional resistance to Sarah's discoveries. Brennan's refusal to acknowledge the professional assessment of evidence that contradicted his assumptions showed the kind of intellectual rigidity that prevented genuine historical inquiry. Miguel's attempt to provide additional context about Spanish colonial exploration patterns met with similar resistance from local officials who seemed determined to reject any evidence that challenged their understanding of regional history. Recent archival research has uncovered documentation of Spanish expeditions that pushed much farther north than previously recognized, he explained, producing copies of the colonial documents that Dr. Castillo had discovered in Spanish archives. These records indicate that Spanish colonial authorities were aware of mineral deposits in territories that correspond to this geographic region. The documentary evidence that supported the possibility of Spanish colonial mining in northern Colorado was dismissed by Brennan and his supporters as irrelevant to their specific area, despite the clear geographic references that placed Spanish expeditions within the general region. Their rejection of archival evidence seemed to reflect a determination to maintain existing historical narratives regardless of contradictory documentation. The situation deteriorated further when Betty Morrison arrived with several other community members who had heard about the archaeological investigation and were concerned about its implications for local identity and historical understanding. Their questions revealed the deep emotional investment that many residents had in their community's established historical narrative, and their resistance to evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about regional development patterns. "This is our history you're talking about changing," Morrison declared, with the passion of someone defending personal identity rather than historical accuracy. "Our families have lived here for generations, and we know what happened in our own community. You can't just waltz in here with some fancy theories and tell us everything we've believed about our heritage is wrong." The conflation of historical accuracy with personal identity revealed the deeper psychological barriers that Sarah's discoveries faced, beyond simple academic skepticism. For many community members, accepting the existence of Spanish colonial mining operations would require abandoning fundamental assumptions about their area's historical development and their families' roles in regional settlement patterns. Dr. Castillo's patient attempts to explain that archaeological discoveries enhanced rather than diminished local historical significance were met with suspicion and hostility from people who viewed any change to established narratives as a threat to community identity. Spanish colonial mining operations would make this region even more historically significant than previously recognized, the professor pointed out. These discoveries would establish your area as an important location in American colonial history, rather than just a 19th century mining district. The logic of Dr. Castillo's argument was lost on community members who seemed to view historical significance as a zero-sum game where acknowledging Spanish colonial activity would somehow diminish the importance of later American settlement. Their resistance reflected the kind of provincial thinking that prevented communities from embracing discoveries that could enhance their historical importance and cultural significance. The confrontation reached its climax when Principal Williams arrived with news that the school district was considering disciplinary action against Sarah for her involvement in what he characterized as unauthorized research activities that have created community controversy and potentially damaged school district relationships with local historical authorities. The threat of academic punishment for legitimate archaeological research represented the ultimate expression of institutional bias against discovery that challenged established authority. Sarah's involvement in this archaeological investigation has created significant problems for the school district, Williams announced, with the gravity reserved for serious disciplinary matters. We've received complaints from community leaders about her role in bringing outside researchers into our area to challenge local historical understanding. The school board is concerned that her actions demonstrate poor judgment and disrespect for community authority. The characterization of Sarah's collaboration with professional archaeologists as evidence of poor judgment was breathtakingly unfair, particularly given Dr. Castillo's validation of her research methodology and the significance of her discoveries. Williams's threat of disciplinary action seemed designed to punish Sarah for succeeding too well in her historical research, rather than for any actual violation of school policies or academic standards. Sarah's parents found themselves caught between pride in their daughter's archaeological achievements and concern about the escalating community opposition that threatened her academic future and social relationships. David and Lynn had initially supported Sarah's research as valuable educational experience, but the intensity of local resistance was creating practical problems that could affect their family's standing in the community. "We're proud of Sarah's dedication and the recognition her work has received from professional archaeologists," David said carefully, trying to balance support for his daughter with acknowledgement of community concerns. "However, we're troubled by the level of controversy that has developed around what should be exciting historical discoveries that benefit the entire community." Dr. Castillo's assessment of the situation was blunt and troubling for everyone involved in the archaeological investigation. "I've encountered bureaucratic resistance to archaeological research before, but rarely have I seen a community so determined to reject evidence that could enhance their historical significance," she admitted privately to Sarah and her parents. "The level of institutional bias against your discoveries is unusual and professionally frustrating." The professor's frank acknowledgement that the community's resistance was exceptional rather than typical provided little comfort to Sarah, who was beginning to realize that her archaeological success was creating more problems than it solved. The validation she had craved was coming at the cost of alienating the community that had known her since childhood and threatening her academic future through institutional retaliation. The evening concluded with an uneasy standoff that left all parties dissatisfied and uncertain about how to proceed. Dr. Castillo remained committed to investigating Sarah's discoveries using proper archaeological methods, but the community opposition was creating practical obstacles that could prevent systematic research from moving forward. Local officials were demanding control over archaeological activities on their territory, while professional researchers were insisting on academic freedom to pursue legitimate scholarly inquiry. Sarah found herself at the center of a conflict that had escalated far beyond her original goal of having her discoveries properly investigated by professional archaeologists. The institutional resistance she faced was no longer just academic skepticism, but active hostility from community leaders who viewed her success as a threat to their authority and historical understanding. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether amateur discovery and professional expertise could overcome institutional bias and community resistance to evidence that challenged established historical narratives. The confrontation that would define Sarah's future came 3 days later, when she made a decision that shocked everyone who thought they knew her. Instead of backing down under community pressure or waiting for institutional approval, Sarah returned to the Esperanza mine alone, driven by an intuition that something crucial remained undiscovered in the deepest sections that even she had never fully explored. Her headlamp cut through the darkness as she descended past the carved chamber, following passages that extended deeper into the mountain than her previous maps had indicated. The tunnel she discovered that morning had been completely hidden behind a rockfall that recent winter storms had partially cleared, revealing an opening that led to chambers more spectacular than anything she had previously encountered. Her breath caught as she emerged into a vast underground hall where Spanish colonial mining operations had left behind not just artifacts, but an entire preserved workspace that looked as if the miners had simply stepped away for lunch rather than abandoning it 3 centuries earlier. Tools lay scattered across stone tables, their metal surfaces protected from corrosion by the chamber's unique microclimate. Clay vessels still contained dried minerals, and wooden containers held samples of ore that gleamed with silver content, so rich it was visible to the naked eye. Most remarkably, wooden shelves along the walls supported dozens of leather-bound journals, their pages preserved by the dry underground environment, filled with Spanish text that documented mining operations, geographical observations, and discoveries that would rewrite textbooks. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed page after page of Spanish colonial documentation that provided detailed records of mining operations extending from Mexico to Colorado, with specific references to the Esperanza site and its significance as a major silver source for Spanish colonial authorities. The journals contained maps showing the extent of Spanish exploration throughout the American West, trade routes that connected Colorado mines to Mexican colonial cities, and production records that revealed the true scope of Conquistador mining operations. One journal, written in the careful script of Captain Francisco de Mendoza himself, contained the expedition leader's final report describing the establishment of mining operations in the territories beyond the Great Northern Mountains, and his decision to seal the richest chambers to protect them from Apache raiders who threaten our continued presence in these remote lands. The document explained that the Spanish had intentionally concealed their northern mining operations to prevent indigenous attacks while maintaining production of silver that was crucial for colonial authorities. Sarah realized that she was looking at the most significant cache of Spanish colonial documentation ever discovered in North America. Evidence that would not only prove her theories, but revolutionize understanding of conquistador exploration and mining throughout the American West. The preserved workspace represented a time capsule that had waited 3 centuries for someone, with the courage and determination to uncover its secrets. Her emergency call to Dr. Castillo brought the archaeological team racing back to the mine, where the professor's examination of the preserved chamber confirmed that Sarah had made one of the most important archaeological discoveries in American history. The documentation and artifacts represented proof of Spanish colonial operations that extended far beyond previously recognized boundaries, with implications that would require complete revision of textbooks and academic understanding of North American colonial history. Sarah, what you've uncovered here will change everything historians thought they knew about Spanish exploration patterns, Dr. Castillo said, her voice filled with professional awe as she examined Captain Mendoza's journals. These documents provide detailed evidence of Spanish colonial mining operations that extended throughout the American West, with production levels and geographical scope that no one imagined possible. News of the discovery spread through archaeological networks with unprecedented speed, bringing teams of researchers from universities across the country to examine evidence that promised to revolutionize colonial American history. The National Geographic Society announced funding for comprehensive excavation, while the Smithsonian Institution began planning exhibits that would showcase the most significant Spanish colonial archaeological find ever made in the United States. The transformation in community attitudes was as dramatic as it was swift. Harold Brennan, who had spent months dismissing Sarah's theories as amateur fantasy, found himself hosting reporters from major newspapers who wanted to interview residents of the town where a teenager had made discoveries that would rewrite history books. The same local officials who had tried to prevent professional investigation were now competing to take credit for supporting the research that had brought international attention to their previously obscure farming community. Principal Williams, who had threatened disciplinary action just days earlier, was now bragging to educational publications about Millbrook Valley High School's role in nurturing the student researcher who had made one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the century. The school district quickly established a Sarah Chen Scholarship for students pursuing archaeological research, funded by donations from institutions wanting to associate themselves with her remarkable achievements. Betty Morrison transformed her bookstore into an informal museum celebrating Sarah's discoveries, selling maps of the Esperanza mine and copies of Spanish colonial documents that proved the historical theories that local experts had spent months dismissing. The same woman who had accused Sarah of seeking attention through fabricated discoveries was now proudly telling visitors that she had always believed in the young researcher's potential for greatness. The vindication was sweet, but Sarah found that success brought responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. College admissions committees competed to recruit the student whose archaeological research had earned international recognition, while scholarship offers poured in from universities throughout the country. Harvard, Yale, and Stanford sent personal representatives to discuss programs that would allow Sarah to continue her research while completing her undergraduate education. Dr. Castillo offered Sarah a position as research assistant with the Institute for Colonial Studies, providing opportunities to participate in archaeological expeditions throughout the American Southwest while earning academic credit toward her degree. The collaboration that had begun with Sarah's desperate outreach to professional archaeologists had evolved into a partnership that would define her career and contribute to revolutionary understanding of Spanish colonial history. The Esperanza mine became a protected archaeological site administered by the National Park Service, with Sarah serving as historical consultant for the research teams that would spend years studying the preserved Spanish colonial workspace and analyzing the thousands of documents that her determination had uncovered. Her amateur maps and documentation provided the foundation for professional excavation that revealed the full extent of Spanish colonial mining operations throughout the region. Most importantly, Sarah's story became an inspiration for amateur researchers and young people who were told that their ideas were impossible or their methods inadequate. Her transformation from rejected amateur to internationally recognized archaeological collaborator proved that systematic dedication and intellectual courage could overcome institutional bias and academic skepticism when supported by compelling evidence and professional validation. The ornate chest that had started everything was carefully opened in conservation laboratories, revealing Spanish colonial documents and silver samples that provided additional confirmation of the Esperanza mine's historical significance. The carved chamber became the centerpiece of a museum that attracted visitors from around the world, while Sarah's story was featured in documentaries and books that celebrated the power of individual determination to challenge established understanding and uncover hidden historical truth. Years later, as Dr. Sarah Chen prepared to defend her doctoral dissertation on Spanish colonial mining operations throughout the American West, she would reflect on the journey that had transformed her from an isolated teenager pursuing questionable theories into a respected researcher whose discoveries had revolutionized understanding of North American colonial history. The girl who had been told that her dreams were impossible had proven that sometimes the most incredible discoveries are made by those who refuse to accept conventional wisdom about what is historically possible. Her legacy lived on in the Sarah Chen Chen Center for Archaeological Research, established at the University of Colorado to support amateur researchers and encourage the kind of systematic investigation that could uncover evidence overlooked by professional surveys. The center's motto, carved in Spanish above its entrance, translated to "Truth waits for those brave enough to seek it," reflecting the spirit of discovery that had driven a farm girl to rewrite history books and prove that legends sometimes contain more truth than scholars are willing to acknowledge. If this incredible journey of discovery and determination has inspired you, we'd love to hear where you're watching from in the comments below. Sarah's story proves that extraordinary discoveries are waiting for those brave enough to challenge conventional wisdom and pursue their passion despite institutional resistance. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because tomorrow we have another amazing story of someone who refused to accept limitations and achieved the impossible. Your support means everything to us. And there are so many more incredible tales of human determination waiting to be shared with you.